welcome to a new episode of our program, The Daily Debate. Thursday evening, I'm Yasmin Bakir. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the outcomes of the G7 summit that took place between the 11th to the 13th of June, specifically in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. And this was the 47th G7 summit that took place. The participant, of course, that were included were leaders of 7 members of states as well as representatives of the European Union. This was the first face-to-face actual meeting that takes place despite of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of important points were raised during this meeting. Maybe one of the major significance of this meeting was the fact that Joe Biden, the US president, was attending this meeting for the first time on an official level. This is the first official meeting that takes place face-to-face between the G7 leaders when Britain had exited the European Union. But definitely the political interests and the common grounds were very similar, and we're going to be discussing that on a higher level and, of course, reflecting on the African continent, specifically Egypt. With this regard, I'm very much delighted to have joining us in the studio to shed further light on this issue, Professor Dr. Ibrahim Hegazy, former Member of Parliament. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Yasmin, for
It's a very interesting topic. I know that maybe people would believe that the G7 is very far away from us, but we will be discussing that. Allow us first, of course, to go to the top stories of this hour and what's heading the news this evening. The head of the General Intelligence arrives in Tripoli and delivers a message from President al-Sisi to the Libyan leader. Now, under the directives of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Major General Abbas Kamel, the head of the Egyptian General Intelligence Services, had arrived today in the Libyan capital of Tripoli on a visit aimed at strengthening joint cooperation relations and supporting the political process and stability in Libya. Now, General Abbas Kamel was received by Mr. Abd al-Hamid al-Dbeiba, the Prime Minister of the government of Libya's national unity, and also senior officials at the headquarters of the Council of the Ministers at the capital of Tripoli. Now, the Chief General Intelligence also met with Mr. Mohammed al-Manoufi, President of the Presidential Council, delivered a message from President al-Sisi for the Libyan government, affirming that Egypt stands behind the brotherly Libyan people and government in its efforts to overcome the delicate stage and also achieve what the brothers in Libya aspire for. They reviewed the latest developments, of course, in Libya, as well as the regional and security issues and also ways to enhance bilateral relations.
Official report, are they?
Now, that was the top stories, but going back again and indulging into our topic today. And when we talk of the G7 and, of course, leaders of very influential powers, and because it comes in a time where COVID-19 is a pandemic that is spread and still ongoing, affecting many countries, the vaccinations issue was on top of the agenda during this meeting. Let's take a look at this report.
Leaders of the Group of 7 wealthy nations staked their claim to leaving the world out of the coronavirus pandemic and crisis, pledging more than 1 billion coronavirus vaccine doses to poorer nations, vowing to help developing countries grow while fighting climate change and backing a minimum tax or multinational firms. At the group's first face-to-face meeting in 2 years, the leaders dangled promises of support for global health, green energy, infrastructure and education, all to demonstrate that international cooperation is back after the upheavals caused by the pandemic and the unpredictability of former US President Donald Trump. During their 3-day summit in southwest England, the G7 leaders wanted to convey that the club of wealthy democracies, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States, is a better friend to poorer nations. US President Joe Biden, who was making his first trip as leader, said it was an extraordinary, collaborative and productive meeting that showed America's back in the business of leading the world alongside nations who share our most deeply held values. But health and environmental campaigners were distinctly unimpressed by the details in the leaders' final communique. Faced with the biggest health emergency in a century and a climate catastrophe that is destroying our planet, they have completely failed to meet the challenges of our times. Despite Johnson's call to vaccinate the world by the end of 2022, the promise of 1 billion doses for vaccine-hungry countries, coming both directly and through donations to the international COVAX program, falls far short of the 11 billion doses the World Health Organization said is needed to vaccinate at least 70% of the world's population and truly end the pandemic. The G7 also backed a minimum tax of at least 15% on large multinational companies to stop corporations from using tax havens to avoid taxes, a move championed by the United States. Biden also wanted to persuade fellow Democratic leaders to present a more unified front to compete economically with Beijing. On China's economic behavior, the group said it would consult on collective approaches to challenging non-market policies and practices which undermine the fair and transparent operation of the global economy. Brexit cast a shadow over that goal during the summit on the coast of southwest England. European Union leaders and Biden voiced concerns about problems with new UK-EU trade rules that have heightened tensions in Northern Ireland. America's allies were visibly relieved to have the US back as an engaged international player after the America First policy of the Trump administration. The G7 also made ambitious declarations during their meetings about girls' education, preventing future pandemics, and financing greener infrastructure globally. On climate change, the Build Back Better for the World plan promises to offer financing for infrastructure, from railways in Africa to wind farms in Asia, to help speed up the global shift to renewable energy. All G7 countries have pledged to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but many environmentalists say that will be too little too late.
Again, you're still watching us here on The Daily Debate. Once again, I'd like to welcome and thank very much Dr. Ibrahim Hegazy, former Member of Parliament, for coming in. Thank you once again, Dr. Ibrahim.
Pleasure.
It's always interesting to hear from your perspective. You're an expert in, both the economic and political scene as a former Member of Parliament, of course, and as a professor in university. So let's first talk about the G7. Why is it called G7, and why is the world very much concentrated on this meeting? I mean, despite the fact that it's the first face-to-face since the pandemic,
Yep.
but it is of significance. So maybe we should start from there.
Actually, you mentioned the start in your start of the session today. The reasons, first of all, what's the G7? G7 is the composition of the largest economies in the world. Mm-hmm. That includes, of course, US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and then Italy. So these are the 7. They used to have with them Russia, but because of their annexation of Crimea in 2014, they did not suspend.
There was a G7 plus 1.
Yes, they always hold plus 1. So they are just a forum that is conducted every year. And also the presidency of the G7 is actually rotating among the members. So that's why it's the time, or this is the role now of the United Kingdom to presidize on the G7 summit. So the purpose here of the meeting, as you mentioned actually at the start, is it comes after COVID-19 pandemic. And then also, as you mentioned, the UK is the first time after they left the EU. So that's another issue. But what is more important is that the United States, as represented by President Biden, actually, this is something to be noticed, especially after Trump and the loss of the election. So he actually came with a message that they are coming back as a United States, a global power, to help their partners in Europe and around the world, especially the C7. So that's why everybody was excited to see how they are going to meet and to present declarations that can help. First of all, the pandemic and how they can recover from the pandemic. Second, about the economy, which is the second angle of the summit, global economy at large. And then thirdly is the issue of research. This is very important because they realized that science played a major role, especially the collaborations globally to recover from the pandemic.
And we've seen vaccinations with many companies across the world, and some merged together as well.
Exactly, yes. And then the fourth angle of the summit declaration was about They want to spread their values of democracy, of rule of law, of gender equality, so many other common ethics among the G7.
There was, it seems to be that while these are the strongest world economies, that they have common grounds and common interests when it comes to the rest of the world. Even though the world is changing dramatically and frequently, and the ratio of the equation of how things have been during the past 47 years is a bit different today. What brings them together under one agenda this year?
What the whole globe faced as the pandemic, and second, also you have a lot of recession that's taking place across the world.
Exactly.
So that's why they needed to come together and then to collaborate and cooperate. And not only that, it's not only among the G7 countries only, but also they have mentioned explicitly on their declaration at the end of the 3 days meeting that they need to also work with the G20, which includes a wider range of countries which have a decent economic...
yes, the Gulf states are part of it, and then we see China, because China's not
Russia,
there, but it's there.
Yep.
And Egypt was a guest as well of honor last time they held the summit before the pandemic.
This time I forgot to mention also that the G7 invited South Korea, and then Australia, India, and South Africa. So they are attended as guests. Because I think they also are part of the G20. Luckily, we have Saudi Arabia and Turkey as part of the Middle East representing on the G20.
The thing is that, as you've correctly mentioned, the pandemic has affected on an economic level these countries per se. Great recession, deficits, higher inflation and unemployment, especially that these countries were those countries that went for a total lockdown, and not just on the first wave, but the second, third and even fourth wave coming into some of these countries. What kind of solutions can they do, and what kind of helping? Because I believe that off-air we were talking about some kind of donations that's going on. Maybe you can help explain why these world countries would go for donations. Who are they donating for exactly?
They are donating for the other less developed countries.
But they have recession themselves.
Yeah, but it's very important to recover, first of all, from the pandemic. So that's why they actually have donated $12 trillion.
That is
that's a huge amount of money. And I think the reason for that also is because, their economy will grow not internally, but also externally. So they need to have recipient countries for their growth potential that is expected after the pandemic.
I'm not into business and economy, but numbers a bit flatter me when you speak of the trillions that you just mentioned, countries that are facing recession, but yet they're donating. So it just makes me wonder, maybe on a briefer level you can help clarify that. What is in for the people of these nations that, they would have to donate to other people on the account of or is it different? Is it a different story?
No,
where's the money coming from anyway?
It comes from the G7, first of all, and this particular 12 trillion was actually declared initially during the pandemic from the G7 countries, collectively, to provide scientific research and to provide vaccination for less needing countries. But another part of their declaration, aside from this 12 trillion, which was already approved at the start of the pandemic, but another part is that they have decided to provide 100 billion, not trillion, 100 billion US dollars for Africa. This is very clear.
That's
so
quite
that's why
a big
I think
amount.
Egypt has to be involved in this piece of the cake, as we say.
Now, when these countries, they set out the agenda on an economic global perspective that the rest of the world would follow, at least from year to year, I'm sure this is built on committees and research and a lot of bilateral meetings between these countries and other countries, specifically Africa. We've seen President Sisi very active when it comes to the diplomatic ties with these countries. And as you've mentioned, Egypt being part of Africa, who gets to determine how will this money be spent in terms of donations?
It is still the G7.
They get to decide.
Along in collaboration also with the United Nations, because they are actually involved in the infrastructure development of countries. They are not going to provide cash money. They are going to provide the development of infrastructure and also job creation. So this is very important. We have to differentiate between the $12 trillion for the vaccinations, and then also in addition to that, they are also donating or providing an amount of 100 billion US dollars for Africa. And this
of course.
That's why I stress the issue of Africa, because it was mentioned clearly on the declaration, and since we are part of Africa, I think we have a major role. Another point that I have also to mention about the G7 summit declarations is the issue of the green economy. They are
environment
very
friendly.
Not only that, they mentioned two things. The climate change, and they have to control it, along with the emissions, so they have a plan.
Which is very ironically not practical on the ground, you do understand that.
Yeah, but what they mentioned
Maybe they pinpoint at China, I think it's the #1 world
as emission, right?
Yes, emissions.
But that would be included under G20. I'm talking about now what the G7.
So then they'll have to throw these declaration to the G20 to handle it.
Exactly, because they mentioned this, that we cannot work by ourselves for our economies only, but we have to work also in a larger profile. But
we share the same globe, so.
But what is important to mention, which I was really amazed from how they think, the issue of biodiversity. You know, they have to maintain, they have to convert this, because there is a loss of biodiversity.
Of course.
And that can make a sort of inequality in the biological state of the globe. So two things are interrelated, the biodiversity, and reverse the issue of loss of biodiversity. And then the second issue is the emission. They have a target of 0 emission by 2030.
But these recommendations, they would require a push on regulations and a leadership political level, because it's not just an economic recommendation for the sake of the safety of the world, but it requires a push in terms of implementing severe regulations and restrictions on countries that do not abide by this declaration. And this is the dilemma that the world has been going through during the past couple of years, specifically speaking of biodiversity and climate change. How's that going to be handled this time?
There is no reinforcement of the declaration of the summit, because they always mention we, W-E, we.
It's a joint sort of
thing. So
it
means that we agree on working on our economies in these dimensions. The issue of green economy, the issue of refreshing and re-energizing the economies, because again, in the pandemic, as you said, they have created a total lockdown in many countries. It was just because of the summer, and there is a lot of countries that rely on tourism that they have to open, although the numbers are high. But this is very important to mention here, that again, I would like to reflect on how Egypt can contribute here.
Of course.
We have already went a lot of directions regarding the green economy in Egypt here. And I think we can approach them as a country here to get part of the pie that is diverted and preserved for Africa and also for the green economy's developments. And so this is...
Because it very much meets with the Egypt's 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Definitely there are a lot of challenges that are being faced this time with the G7, a part of the biodiversity and the climate change. What do you think was very noticeable? And when we speak of that, we want to kick off the significance of the Democrats' leadership in the U.S. under Biden and how that has changed. We know that Trump came in an era where a lot of these summits were very, I wouldn't say on hold, but not an active role being played by the United States as usual, as the world power. But we're seeing it kicking off in again. So how is that going to weigh out this year?
I think one of the most important results coming out of the G7 summit, the 47 summit, is the issue that the U.S. is elevating the hold that it plays on funding the multinational and international institutions. And so re-injecting money in the World Health Organization, WHO, re-injecting money on developments.
And the United Nations as well, which was also
programs and institutions. And, during Trump, actually he put a hold on all of this. He put freezing of the membership of the U.S. So Biden coming back and saying, we are back and we are going to fund. That was a challenge because everybody was expecting what U.S. is coming to say. So by declaring this from Biden, he actually forced other G7 members to contribute.
On a more serious level, as it used to be.
Exactly.
Yes.
And he mentioned at the end, he said, luckily, I'm glad that everybody now is collaborating and collectively putting their share of funding.
Now, another interesting thing that was agreed during the meeting by the leaders is to champion freer, fairer trade within a reformed trading system, a more resilient global economy, and also started with new taxation system.
Yes.
But then there's repercussions to that. So how's that being weighed out as well?
First of all, it does make sense if I'm donating money for vaccinating less developed countries.
In return, what are you going to give us?
It means that you are now ready to collaborate with me in terms of trade, so you should not really block. Second thing, the issue of global common tax rate, which was on the papers, as I heard it, is 15%. because there are other countries that are actually diminishing that tax rate to attract more people and more investments and more corporations.
But that's
So,
because the nature of...
but that's what they want. They want because
they want it a general
because
sort of
that means
global thing.
Exactly, because that means that you are shifting the development of free zones areas in other countries that provide these kind of incentives at the expense.
Isn't that a new world order, Dr. Hegazy, that they're talking about, where everything is equal regardless of how outstanding or poor or well-off you are as an economy?
You are right. You are absolutely, because
But that's going to diminish certain economies. Are you aware? Are they aware of that? They probably are aware of that.
Which economies?
The poorer people.
Exactly. But that's why I'm giving you more funds.
Yeah, that's that.
So
I see the irony of that. So it's basically, I give you more funds, I diminish your economies, I'm in more control of you, and you pay what you need. And all right, it seems to be very interesting here. I can't help but just jump into the G20 into this comparison, because we're talking about well-off countries who are producers to resources. We're talking about the number 2 competing economy is China, which the G7 is not very pleased with. But then again, aren't these goals originally very much contradicting with the G20 goals, and how are they fitting in together?
Well, they are not that much contradicting, because still China wants a free economy. Russia wants a free economy.
I wouldn't pay the 15% though.
But that's for them. I don't know how they're going to reinforce it or force it on the G20. But bear in mind that they explicitly also mentioned that all of our declarations will not be reinforced on ourselves only, but we will include the G20 members, which includes China, it includes Russia, it includes Brazil, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, among other, Mexico. So it means that they are expanding the declarations or the results from the summit to other countries to abide by them.
Sounds more like reinforcement on them. The leaders also said that they were committed to multilateralism. What kind of partnership do they need to build on that in this regard?
Basically, they want countries to buy out in their declaration results, that we're going to give you money, but give us also business. That's why they stressed the resilience of economies, not just their own economies post-pandemic, but they also talked about the freer trade, because obviously these are signs for China, more or less.
But they are aware that this kind of equation didn't work out well with the European Union, which directly resulted for the UK to exit. So, and then they want to sort of apply that sort of free trade thing on a much more international perspective, regardless of the different regulations from country to country. You see where that plays out as well.
Partially, I agree with you, Yasmin. However, let me also put a line between the era of Trump and the era of Biden as the representative of the United States. So obviously this was, a sort of a quarrel between Trump and the EU. But I think from the way and the side discussions and meetings that was set aside from the summit itself, you can see explicitly that the United States is going to open up again with the European Union.
Well, the G7, or the group of G7, has a lot of very rigid factors, if I may say, when it comes to their industrialized democracies, when it comes to the formation of these 7 countries and what brings them in together. This report's going to help us take a much more in-depth look at the group of G7.
The G7 is an informal bloc of industrialized democracies: the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, that meets annually to discuss issues such as global economic governance, international security, and energy policy. Proponents say the forum's small membership promotes collective decision-making, but critics note that it often lacks follow-through and excludes important emerging powers. The United States, France, Italy, Japan, the UK, and West Germany formed the group of 6 in 1975 to provide a venue for the non-communist powers to address pressing economic concerns, which included inflation and recession sparked by the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries oil embargo. Canada joined the following year. Cold War politics invariably entered the group's agenda. The European Union has participated fully in the G7 since 1981 as a non-enumerated member. It is represented by the presidents of the European Council, which comprises the EU member states' leaders, and of the European Commission, the EU's executive body. Russia belonged to the forum from 1998 through 2014, when the bloc was known as the Group of Eight, but it was suspended following its annexation of Ukraine's Crimea region. The G7's future has been challenged by continued tensions with Russia and, increasingly, China, as well as by internal disagreements over trade and climate policies. The aggregate gross domestic product of G7 member states make up about 45% of the global economy in nominal terms, down from nearly 70% 3 decades ago. President Joe Biden has pledged to restore the United States' historical commitment to multilateralism. In a sign of renewed cooperation, the G7 reached a historic agreement ahead of its 2021 summit in Cornwall, England, to overhaul the global rules for corporate taxation. At that year's gathering, the group also launched a major global infrastructure program to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike the United Nations or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the G7 is not a formal institution with a charter and a secretariat. The presidency, which rotates annually among member states, is responsible for setting the agenda of each year's summit and arranging logistics for it. Ministers and envoys, known as Sherpas, hammer out policy initiatives at meetings that precede the gathering of national leaders. Non-member countries are sometimes invited to participate in the G7 meetings.
Welcome back again. You're still watching us here on The Daily Debate. I'm still delighted to have joining me Professor Dr. Ibrahim Hegazy, former Member of Parliament. Now, Dr. Ibrahim, while the vaccination issue was topping the agenda naturally because of the pandemic, yet that also proved how important the scientific research is and the collaboration in this regard between the developed countries to help save the world. How important is research today, and what kind of more efforts should be sort of enhanced in this regard, not just for the virus, but for anything that revolves around research?
I think, for me, when I read the issue of the declarations, the results coming out of the summit, one angle that really got my attention is the focus extremely on research, on scientific research, and allow me to read part of what they have declared as shared values, and this is quotations from them. The global response to COVID-19 has demonstrated the progress that arises from, which is very important, long-term collaboration, which puts science at the heart of the prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and resilience of the globe. And so by declaring this as a shared value among the G7, you can identify that we might expect a new era of collaborations, not just on economic levels, but also on scientific levels. Because they have mentioned that now we are recovering, but we need to prepare ourselves from the coming pandemics, and they mention it is coming anyway. So by the issue of collaborating scientifically, we can be ready for the next one. And then this is very important, because I don't think any country will be ready for another lockdown. Luckily, we have not lockdown for long, because our economy is large and our population is large. So we have the issue of the balance between both.
But to get there, Dr. Ibrahim, that requires a number of potentials. You need to pay better attention to research in university level. You need to have a much more increased budget when it comes to spending on research, and also we're talking about the use of technology that is playing a very vital role.
Yep.
We know that the developed countries don't have much of this as a problem, but if you're talking about collaboration with the world, because you can have researchers that are very good in terms of their potentials in the Far East, for instance, and how are they going to be collecting these researchers or researches to be able to be put under this umbrella for prevention of future? I know it's a very complicated question, but it's
you touch a very
natural.
sensitive issue, because obviously you can see, the war that is already going on between the Russian vaccine, which is the Sputnik, because of Russia.
This is specifically why I asked you that, and that played so much off with people who were very scared and very concerned and very worried up until this moment.
Again, we're talking about the G7, so that's why it's their declaration. Obviously, there is a lot of politics also between AstraZeneca, which is a UK-based one, and then Moderna and Pfizer as a US. So there is a lot of
But
politics.
Moderna never came out of the US, by the way, not as far as my concern is, for many
because the
technical reasons, possibly.
Because the US is already taking them, 300 million, they need a lot of that. And so Pfizer is the first intake of the vaccine for other countries, including the United Arab Emirates and many other, Lebanon, Israel, so many other countries are vaccinated by Pfizer. But the issue here, for me, it's very important to stress the fact that we are witnessing a different form of collaboration. Usual collaboration is in political issues, on like democracy, like the rule of law. Usually it is also on economic, and trade. But it's the first time they mentioned the value and the importance of scientific research. And as you mentioned, technology here plays a role. I think we have good scientists in Egypt, so we expect also a decent collaboration if we are active in jumping into the vehicle that is moving after the G7 summit.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the political issues, because political issues always have to have a say or force themselves on the ground when it comes to any meeting, even if it's on an economic perspective. And specifically here, I'm talking about that during the meeting of the NATO, which followed the G7 meeting, an important encounter took place between the US president and the Russian. And how do you read this encounter and its outcome, especially as we've seen couple of months of accusations and statements going back and forth between Biden and Putin with regard to the political grudges? How is that going to be also forming? And maybe this is an opportunity to look into a wider scope of the Biden administrations and how it sees the Russian relations.
Let me also take it from another angle, if you allow me, Yasmin.
Please.
What was an outcome of the NATO meetings that took place after the G7 summit were the side talks between France and Turkey. And I think this is very important for us to know that they have agreed, which is the first time now that Turkey agree that they have to take people out of Libya. The insurgents that they have sent before. And so France, and they decided to collaborate with France to free Libya from this. And I think that's why our head of intelligence, Mr. Abbas Kamel, have went, because I think...
Let's hope that Turkey is serious about it this time, because that's not the first encounter.
I tell you why it's going to be serious, because Trump is no longer there. And so Biden now is taking this kind of steps to protect the democracy all over the world. So this is very important, because you can see now the tone of voice of Turkey have shifted with the G7 outcomes, as well as Biden coming to the NATO and declaring that I am back and US is back. And so this was his message. Following this, he got the blessing of the G7 presidents to meet with Putin. And I think this is another issue, but it's more of the two countries, not in the global perspective.
No, not in the global, not very much. We talked about how the G7, sees the world, how the G7 helps Africa. How is the G7 sharing its relations with the Middle East now in this regard? I'm sure that this was also brought up on top of the agenda during their meeting, one way or the other.
They talk not on political terms, quite honestly, because
if
they invited South Africa as a guest, I think this reflects the value of Africa, not just the Middle East. The Middle East is so immersed in political concerns and political divergence. And so the issue of raising problems, I don't think was on the agenda of,
it's not the place
the G7.
for it.
But it was, how can we move forward with the new era of the United States with Biden, and also, as you mentioned, the UK. And bear in mind, the UK is the president of the summit for this year. And so the agenda was very explicitly trying to develop economies, because my understanding is with the exit, with Brexit for UK, their economy is actually slowing down a little bit, because there is still disagreement regarding the trade between the UK and the European Union. So I think it's a way of refreshing also and revitalizing the relationship that exists between the G7. Most of them, if you exclude Japan, most of them are related to Europe, with the exception of Canada and US. But the rest, the other ones are predominantly European countries.
I mean, as you speak, and maybe I've mentioned that off air a little bit, is that this is the 47th, and the world is changing. They're trying to impose a new world order. 47 years, a lot of things concerning the economy are not the same as they used to be 47 years ago. I believe that since the end of the Second World War. And what I'm trying to say is that what is the possibility of them either increasing the number or changing the title or the format or whatever it is to meet other emerging economies around the world? And it doesn't just have to be throwing them into the G20, you know what I mean? The decision makers.
The same question applies for the Security Council. You know, why there are permanent members in the Security Council.
Why are they permanent?
So,
that's a good question to ask at this moment. Why are there still permanent members?
Because this is
the way the world works.
Exactly. This is how the world is controlled, actually. And there is a hidden agenda that these, in particular, 7 countries are supposed to be democratic countries. So sometimes you can find other countries.
Well, are supposed to be affirmation from you that they are or they're not?
It is not declared officially, but you can sense that because China is a big economy. But they said, oh no, it is not a big economy because they didn't mention it officially. But the reasons for excluding China from
by
the
book
summit,
they call it a totalitarian sort of, authoritarian rather.
You are using much nicer word. I'm very explicit.
It's a very research type of word.
But China, why China is not included? Because they said the population, the per capita income of the Chinese population is not an advanced or a large economy.
Interesting. Although the irony of everything, they're probably being owned there at this hall and what they're wearing is made in China, but then when it comes to the per capita it's a different story.
Exactly.
We're seeing also, because there have been, I mean, we've seen the guest, as you said, South Africa taking part, and
South Korea.
Yes, South Korea as well, and that's a different thing. And where does South Korea come in? Even if it's a guest, but I mean, where does it come in and kick off? Should they, when they invite people like guest of honors, in other words, are they trying to introduce them to what's happening in the inner circle, so that when it comes to donations and what they need back, people would have a better, clear understanding of what they should give back in return for these donations?
Well,
I mean, pardon me for putting it this way, but that's...
I'm trying to articulate my words. Basically, you have somebody who has the money, who has the ideas, who has the declarations, but you need to have a recipient on the other side. India is one of the recipients. South Korea is supposed also to be collaborating in either funding, which is not necessarily because they are not part of the G7, but basically you have either the recipient of donations and funding and collaboration, and others who are supposed to help spreading the word in their areas, because India, South Korea, Australia, and South Then part of it, because of, from my understanding, is that since the UK is presiding over the G summit, then obviously they are going to have their former colonies involved, like India, like South Australia, is still part of the UK, and also South Africa. South Korea, it may be because they need a collaboration with Japan, so they have selected, or the UK have selected, because they are the one who invite guests.
Yes, of course.
They have specifically, reflected their previous colonies under the umbrella that they are large economies still, and they are part of the G20. So it's one way of introducing that they are no longer G7 only, but they are actually 11. So the other 9, Russia and China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Argentina, I call them the diminishing parts, the peripheral parts, but these are the major ones. Interesting
question. Interesting way of saying it, because what I wanted to also get better clarifications from you is the fact that, well, now the way that on a national level, I mean, in each of these countries, the people, they seem to also have a lot of economic struggles, just like the rest of the world.
Sure.
And that would put more pressure on their governments in regard to support them in an economic perspective. Because they're democratic countries by nature, how are they balancing this out between their responsibility as world powers to, and their responsibilities and commitments to the rest of the world, but at the same time ensuring... It seems to me my questions are a bit difficult today.
No. I'm going to answer the question.
Yeah, please do.
First of all, again, I'm looking from a political perspective, not from an economic perspective. When you look at AID, the international developing agencies, whether it is British or US or Canadians, you know, when you look at the process and the system, how it works, I declare I have funds for you, and you are the recipient of these funds. But you cannot spend it except on either my products or my expertise, like the technical assistance.
All right.
So here, you know, I give you the money, but you give it back to me. So here, when you say people in their economies are still struggling, well, that's one way of making factories work in my country if I gave you the money, and also making my human skills and technical skills that I possess as a country to help you. So it's money giving, but at the same time, you are not taking it cash.
So then, and as long as the nations are very well aware of that, then I don't think that there should be a problem in this regard.
Of course, they are aware, because this is not something new. You know, you know, whether we have the Canadian or the U.S., you know, it's this way.
I mean, I'm going to ask a question that might not be very much related, but somehow interrelated, because you know, I'm sort of reflecting back on what people might be concerned about, especially those who are the general public, who are not very much accommodated to how these certain meetings go. The currencies themselves and the value and the degrading of currencies are changing. We're seeing new electronic currencies rising, and people are trying to consider or wondering if in the future the way this money would be spent or returned back would change into a virtual electronic form of currency other than the ordinary US dollar currency, for instance, which has forever been an international currency. You know, as an expert, do you see this changing just like everything else that's changing around the world?
I don't think so, no. You know, because
the hard currency will always...
Of course, because Bitcoin is still, for me, it's still a fiasco. You know? Nobody knows exactly how it is run, but again, maybe there are experts who can talk about this. But basically, you still have to support your currency with your export.
Of course.
Your exports, your natural resources. And so there is no way that will take away this from them, you know, especially the major players.
Well, let's hope not, because then the world would be really different in this regard. Absolutely. Unfortunately, our time is up. Professor Dr. Ibrahim Hegazy, a former member of Parliament, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine, Doctor. And the episode has come to an end. I'd like to thank you for watching and stay tuned for more coming up on Nile International.